Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Now, President Trump's row with Twitter could be about more than the freedom of speech which is guaranteed under the American Constitution. Perhaps it is about the very opposite, deciding who controls the narrative and what that narrative should be. This is Roundtable. Maybe the president is hoping that social media companies will be cowed by his decision to impose new laws on these tech giants. Or maybe they, in riling Mr. Trump, are only doing what their customers want and hoping that that is the way to bigger and bigger profits.
The technology industry has begun a legal fightback against an executive order by US President Donald Trump. What began as a social media spat has evolved into a simmering legal battle for the digital age, with leading experts across the political spectrum fearing for the future of free expression on the internet. President Trump has threatened to shut down Twitter, regulate social media, and expand the government's power to oversee the web. That was after Twitter flagged 2 of his tweets about postal voting as misleading. But as protests raged over the death of George Floyd in police custody, there was further controversy. Trump posted a threat: "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." That was seen as breaking social media rules about inciting violence, and Twitter covered it with a warning. Facebook chose not to act, leading to backlash from users and employees. CEO Mark Zuckerberg has since promised to review its content policies, whilst Twitter says it enforces its rules impartially for all users, regardless of their background or political affiliation. But who gets to decide what we see online, and how far should the limits of free speech go?
And we welcome to the program Ilan Manor. He's in Tel Aviv and is the author of The Digitalization of Public Diplomacy. We say hello to Renata Avila in Berlin, international human rights lawyer and executive director at Smart Citizen Foundation. And then we go to Pennsylvania, USA, where we find Josh Pasek, associate professor of communications and media at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research. Great to have you all with us. This is a question for each one of you. It all started really with the California voting and Trump weighing in on that long before when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So let me ask you, Renata, first, and this is for every single one. Has Twitter suddenly grown a conscience?
No, I don't think that companies have a conscience. I think that they have calculations. And, like in this ecosystem of Silicon Valley giants mediating the communication infrastructure, Twitter is they have less to lose, more to gain from this disruption, and they are signaling something to the markets. I think that they're better placed, and their business model gains more from this attitude that they are taking. I do not think that is a matter of principles. I think that is a matter of the market, and they are preemptively protecting their business model and reinventing their business model on the go. And I think that it's very smart. It's a very smart step ahead of the smallest player, I will say, in the market of social media, to be proactive and to position themselves as the trusted ally of civil society while defending, their obligation is to stand by human rights principles, and the principal actions is just a calculation, and it's a smart one, I think.
Okay, and Twitter being very small compared to Facebook. Facebook initially apparently reluctant to get in on this, then it did, and Mark Zuckerberg latterly made this statement: "Our current policy is that if content is actually inciting violence, then the right mitigation is to take that content down, not let people continue seeing it behind a flag." There is no exception to this policy for politicians or newsworthiness. Ilan, are they doing it for the same reason that Renata suggested, that they have more to gain in the long run from this? And if so, what?
Yes, I agree on the point of a conscience. I think waiting for social media companies to develop a conscience is a bit like waiting for the Messiah. It's been 5,000 years, and so far he hasn't showed up. I think this may have been a strategic shot across the bow, an attempt to see if social media companies could navigate the waters leading up to the upcoming elections, where we're likely to see more politicians weighing in on things and more politicians spreading false information. I also think that this may have been an attempt by Twitter specifically to better its image at a time of social unrest in the United States and realign itself not with the propagandists, but rather with the civil society organizations.
Okay, so and we'll bring Josh in at this point. Who do you think, therefore, is censoring whom when the First Amendment in America gives all citizens the right to free speech?
Well, the right to free speech doesn't really extend to social media companies per se, right? That's outside of what it specifically adjudicates. It's about government's ability to directly censor things. So unless we end up in a situation where government were in some way more directly in charge of social media companies, that wouldn't be a relevant piece directly. It gets more towards sort of understanding of American social norms and the sense that people shouldn't be restricted, and that's where there's more competition here. But that challenge is still one that is functionally legally on social media companies. They can say, we only allow this kind of speech on our platform, and they don't really have pushback from the law per se to do that because social media companies aren't in any way federalized at this point. I think there is a concern that you could end up in a situation where these companies get further regulated. And that is actually something I think they're proactively thinking about, right? With people like Elizabeth Warren, who has suggested that maybe social media companies need to be more further regulated. Should someone like that win power, if social media companies are showing they're regulating themselves, they may be less susceptible to new regulations that would push them in different directions.
Yeah, I want to get into the legal side of this a little bit later. I've got an interesting quotation to come up towards the end of the program. But let's take a look at this. This is from the White House. As a nation, we must foster and protect diverse viewpoints in today's digital communications environment where all Americans can and should have a voice. Ilan, what did you make of it when you heard that?
Well, I mean, I think there's two issues here. The first issue is that as we understand free speech generally in societies, and not just in America, free speech is supposed to protect your right to speak your mind within certain limits. But the freedom of speech does not guarantee you a megaphone. And that's what social media companies are. Basically, Facebook and Twitter provide you with a megaphone which enables you to reach a large and diverse public. And that's not necessarily promised within the idea of freedom of speech. Now, the idea of diversity of opinion is, of course, always a good idea, but we have to draw the line where we're dealing with lies, fabrications, and calls for violence. And social media companies aren't doing enough to remove this kind of content that definitely breaches their codes of conduct. In fact, certain governments on a regular basis send social media companies tens of thousands of accounts that are spreading hate online and are inciting to violence, and social media companies are very slow to remove these accounts.
Isn't it about time that they did, that in fact this is long overdue? Renata.
Yes, I have a very different take on this. Article 19, I refer more to the international human rights frame protecting freedom of speech. Article 19 dictates that you must be free to seek and receive information without interference. And the way social media curates how I receive the news, my reception of news, the way it selects my information diet, and the way it reinforces one view on the reader. I'm more concerned, on the person on the other side of the screens receiving the information, and how before we hold the remote control and we could change and decide what to see, what to watch, we could get different newspapers and have the full version of it and decide what we want to read in detail or not. And now this selection, I mean, there's part of truth on what the White House is saying on the lack of diversity on on the reinforcement of views that the current architecture of social media creates. And I'm concerned about it. And I'm concerned about it because it's something lacking transparency and lacking accountability, and something shaped by the values and by the views of the US. And not only the US, by those designing the platforms in the US.
Okay, Renata, this one's for each one of you, and don't ever wait for me necessarily to ask a question, but I'm putting this one out there. As far as I understand it, the executive order concerns whether companies can be prosecuted as publishers of information that is false. I think you all agree that both the White House and the social media companies are acting out of self-interest. But is it possible that President Trump will actually end up hurting himself by allowing misinformation that he puts out there to lend these companies liable for prosecution? Josh, you kick off with that one.
So I think there are a variety of fascinating questions when it comes to what the implications are going to be of allowing that. And I think it is highly ironic that one of the people who's sort of known for being among the widest spreaders of inaccurate information is the person pushing this. What the implications are in practice, especially during the Trump administration, are likely to be rather targeted, right? They're not going to just go for absolutely everything that's inaccurate. They'd be much more likely to challenge things that they think are negative information about them, because that's the way this administration works. The long-term implications of it are also unclear because it's an executive order and the next administration can just go back on it as well. So I don't know exactly what will happen vis-a-vis the order itself and whether it'll even be found legal in practice. But it's an interesting challenge.
And equally, oh yes, please.
There are also a lot of global ramifications here because, we've been looking at Donald Trump, which is a very good example, but politicians around the world are using these platforms. And the question is, will this kind of executive order lead to additional legislation regarding social media in other countries? For instance, in Israel, they're not defined a publisher, they're just a platform, so they can't be liable in court. But this might also have a global ripple effect, which will far outlast Donald Trump.
And you want to come back on that one, Renata?
Yes, I think that they should be regulated. I think that we need clear guidelines on this. I mean, they play such an important role globally on delivering information, and I think that they should comply strictly to the human rights law frame. And I think that, of course, we don't want Donald Trump leading that process, and that process should be like a guided by the UN system, I think, and that would be a good guidance. Where a universal set of rules that we already have, the UN, the global human rights frame, should be the guidance, the primary guidance to guarantee equal treatment of all citizens, and of course restrict things that are forbidden globally, like such as hate speech.
Ilan, as the author of the Digitalization of Public Diplomacy, when you wrote that book, did you see where this was going?
I didn't see that it was going necessarily that it will be led by Donald Trump, but it was obvious that there is a major problem on national levels and international levels with the spread of false information. And the diplomatic community around the world was already getting together in an attempt to see what could be done about it. But of course, because these companies are based in America, this would rely mostly on American legislation. We're focusing here on a politician who lies, which is not necessarily surprising. Politicians tend to lie. Some of them have been taken to court, even in the UK. But we're dealing with a much, much bigger phenomenon of lies that can subvert democracy and lies that can hurt democracy to the extent that it becomes paralyzed. So there's a trickle-down effect here that when politicians use these platforms to lie and spin, it is then copycat by other users and other parties and other institutions.
We're talking here about social media platforms, but when it comes to the mainstream media, the traditional media, if you like, which the Democrats seem to trust because it goes into fact-checking, etc., will it have an effect on them, if not under the current legislation that's planned, but in the way that they behave?
I think more mainstream media organizations in the United States operate not all that differently than they have historically, right? And that they have sort of a set of journalists who have a set of particular norms that they adhere to, that go through rigorous fact-checking processes, et cetera. In the social media environment, right, you have a broadcast outlet that doesn't include that same set of norms. Interestingly, in the US right now, we also have a bunch of relatively right-leaning media sources that also don't use that set of norms, that have become much more popular in recent years. That set of challenges is, I think, in many ways what's playing out both here and on the world stage with what's going on right now, in the sense that as we are engaging, as social media companies are broadcasting messages more widely, those broadcast messages serve to promulgate things that might have gotten cut off otherwise. And those messages now become relevant because they've already been broadcast, right? Especially if they've already been broadcast by somebody with a bully pulpit.
It is self-perpetuating. If you say it loud enough and long enough, then it becomes important. Renata, I think I cut you off.
No, and I was agreeing with him on the sense that actually we get a little bit captive in the idea of, sometimes we inflate the power of digital. And news outlets and television still play a very important role, and studies at Harvard University by Professor Joachim Benkler, for example, indicate that, for example, right-wing media has a far more, a bigger impact than social media in polarizing, in distributing fake news, and in creating this capture of democracy. I also wanted to highlight the increasingly important role of electoral authorities. And I think that the 2020 upcoming election in the US, is going to teach us very tough lessons on how to defend free speech while also defending the democratic institutions. We will need to be very creative and vigilant to preserve both.
Okay, and talking about the crossover between digital media and mainstream media, here's a piece from the New York Times, an opinion piece by Tim Wu, a professor at Columbia Law School. And this takes us to the legal ramifications. He wrote, "In short, the order is a legal dumpster fire, and the danger is that even if and when it fails in court, it may nonetheless have succeeded in its goal of intimidating social media companies into not doing what the First Amendment gives them the right to do." Ilan, and we'll take this in whatever order after that you wish. It is suggesting that there could be intimidation. My suggestion is that these companies will say, hang on, we cannot be intimidated, and there's one almighty fight coming up.
So we also have to think about the fact that the election is coming up, and what Trump would like to be the dominant narrative of the election. Is the election again going to be about freedom of speech and his right to say his opinion, and the liberal media organizations coming out gunning for his blood? Or is it going to be about the protests that we're witnessing in America at the moment? And I think that Trump is making the right decision politically in trying to drag America into a very fundamental and complicated argument about freedom of speech, about what constitutes a media organization, and about what are the responsibilities that we expect from social media companies. And this is tailored to Trump's political agenda. I mean, he's the one man battling in favor of all of his supporters against these monoliths that have taken over the agenda. Again, somewhat funny, given that he used Twitter during the first election to get elected in the first place.
What do you reckon? Josh, yeah, carry on, then I'll ask a question.
Yeah, I don't think it's that ironic with regard to Trump, because if you look at his modus, it's actually been quite consistently to just find new issues to take over whenever he's getting what he views as a bad news cycle. And so picking a fight with Twitter might seem absurd to all of us, and particularly if that fight extends to the rest of social media, but it's something on which I think he does have much more solid ground than trying to figure out how to navigate what's going on right now with officer-involved killings and things of the like.
Will it fail in court, as the opinion piece suggests? Josh, will it fail in court?
I mean, my guess is that it will. I don't know specifically. I don't know the specific legal the specific legal way it's going to play out. But my sense is that it would be very hard for this to get all the way through without some push from Congress either way.
Renata, sorry, once again I
Things,
stopped you in
yes.
full flow, but please continue.
Two things, important things. One is the increased, the Supreme Court of Justice in the US is looking more and more conservative. And Trump has played like a very key strategic move on naming the justices. And that might play a big role. The WikiLeaks case is coming to the court as well. If Julian Assange is extradited, that might be also a big threat on the right to publish online. And the third element that I think that is very important to is the signal of social media companies and Silicon Valley in general on either endorsing or non-endorsing candidates. And that's a very dangerous line that they should abstain to cross, but some of them are not crossing. Some of them, like I remember this headline of the New York Times of Silicon Valley saying anyone but Bernie Sanders, for example. How can we trust the neutrality of social media companies delivering the message to all potential voters, that message will not be tainted by political vengeance or by political...
And isn't that therefore something that Donald Trump might want to say? Hang on, how can we trust you when you do things like that? Ilan, I'll come to you in just a second. Renata, finish off on that point. He could make capital out of it.
Precisely that. If I cannot see the algorithm and if I cannot audit the algorithm that they run, how can I be sure? I mean, if I was the president of the United States, if they don't like me, how can I be sure that their algorithm will not favor or harm my political campaign? We are like now playing in unknown fields, and the political campaigns are like run by social media companies mostly in a non-transparent way, and electoral authorities cannot account them, cannot verify that it is done in a fair way.
Are these companies too big, not just to fail, but too big to be intimidated?
Well, yeah, it's almost not too big to fail, but too big to regulate. And I don't think that that's the case. We have to remember that Standard Oil was also, regulated in the end through antitrust legislation. It just took a lot of goodwill, and it took political leadership. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is even aiming in that direction at the moment, actual, real regulation of social media. I tend to agree more with what Josh said, that this is a very good news cycle. I mean, the debate that we're having now has been had by academics for the past 4 or 5 years, and now it's going to be had on television sets throughout America. And so I think what we're seeing is a political move here. It is interesting that the whole debate stemmed from the fact that Twitter basically, I think, kind of censored 2 tweets by Trump and removed 1 tweet out of the thousands that he's published. So it's a very big question also to see what Twitter's next step is going to be.
Yeah, and another irony is that Twitter's presumably made millions, if not billions, out of Donald Trump's tweets, and there they go, sort of knocking him off of the knees. Renata, you're nodding.
Precisely. Social media companies play different roles. You know, they sell advertising, they sell services, even on this advertising to government units, and then they play this good citizen role. And I think that they need to choose what they are. Are they distributors of news? Are they advertisers? Are they like public infrastructure? We need to, to regulate them. I think that there should be consensus on what they are, and also the impact beyond borders that social media companies have, because there's a big focus on the US now. But I think that my duty at this table is to bring also the global perspective on this, and how easily, like the thing of the Donald Trump situation is not new. I mean, Twitter has been like flagging and taking off public leaders from the global south for ages.
Quick final thought from you, Josh. If they are, as has been suggested in this, hypocrites, the companies out for profits, the president out for personal gain, why do we still continue to believe them?
We continue to believe them because they play an outsized role in the current media landscape. because they, in many ways, shape the kinds of discourse that we're having at the moment, whether that discourse is being shaped via actual sort of person decisions that know this violates a standard, or algorithmically, right, in terms of what gets shown to whom. They play an outsized role right now in what the media environment looks like, and they are not the traditional media, which has lost tons of trust in the United States. Trust in US media has gone down drastically. And that's a lot of why Trump was able to sort of gather some of the support he was in the first place. But it creates an opening for others
So
to
it is
become.
not necessarily that they are that great, either as politicians or as media outlets. It's just that what they're replacing could be equally bad or perhaps even worse in the eyes of the public. I have to end it there. Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. We have Tel Aviv, we have Berlin, we have Pennsylvania, and you've been watching Roundtable. My thanks to the guests, my thanks to you for watching. We hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now.